After 20 years of pouring my heart and soul into my marriage, my husband Mark chose his career over us, leaving me feeling like a mere accessory to his ambitions. But I wasn't defeated. I wasn't broken. While he thought he could prioritize work over our family and erase the bond we once shared, I was silently crafting a new life, one that would make him reconsider the choices he had made. This is the story of how I transformed my pain into power, rediscovered my passions, and found the strength to reclaim my happiness. With every sacrifice I made for our family, I never imagined I would be left feeling so alone. But through my journey, I learned that sometimes losing yourself leads to finding a version of you that's stronger than ever. Before I dive into my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel inspired by what you hear, consider subscribing. It gives me the courage to share my truth. Now let's get into my story. My life with Mark had always seemed like a steady rhythm, a melody we composed together over 2 decades. But somewhere along the way, the harmony shifted, and I found myself living in a dissonant echo of what once was. Mark, my husband of 20 years, had chosen his demanding career over the family we built, and that choice left me standing at a crossroads, uncertain but determined. I remember the moment I realized the distance between us was no longer temporary. It was a chasm growing wider with every missed dinner, every canceled plan, every late night he spent buried in work. For years, I held on to hope that he would find his way back to us, that the man who once promised to be my partner in all things would remember the life we dreamed of together. But as the months turned into years, Mark's priorities became painfully clear. It wasn't always like this. When we first married, Mark balanced his ambitions with a genuine presence at home. He was there for birthdays, for school recitals, for quiet Sunday mornings wrapped in the warmth of our small family. Those days felt like a promise that no matter the storms ahead, we would weather them side by side. But ambition, like a tide, can pull even the strongest bonds apart if left unchecked. Mark's career began demanding more of him: longer hours, frequent travel, endless meetings. The man who once held my hand during storms now seemed distant, preoccupied with deadlines and office politics. I tried to understand, to be patient, reminding myself that he was working for us, for our future. But the future felt like a distant mirage, one I was chasing alone. I found myself standing in the doorway of our home many evenings, watching the clock tick past the hour when Mark should have been home. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I would sit at the kitchen table, sipping cold coffee, trying to make sense of the knot tightening in my chest. The man I loved was slipping away, replaced by a stranger whose eyes always seemed fixed on something beyond me. The emotional distance was harder to bear than the physical absence. When Mark was home, his mind was elsewhere, distracted and distant. Conversations became brief exchanges about schedules or chores, lacking the warmth and connection we once shared. I missed the laughter, the shared dreams whispered before sleep, the feeling of being truly seen and understood. I wrestled with my own feelings, torn between loyalty to our marriage and the growing realization that I was losing myself. Was I asking too much? Was my desire for closeness selfish? I buried these questions deep, hoping that if I just held on a little longer, things would change. But the truth was impossible to ignore. Mark's career had become his world, and I was no longer a part of it. The man who had once promised to be my partner in all things was choosing work over us, over me. The weight of that choice settled heavily on my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I felt the sting of betrayal, not from a dramatic act, but from a slow, silent unraveling. Despite the ache, I refused to let this define me. I was determined to reclaim my happiness, to find a new path where my worth wasn't tied to Mark's presence or absence. I wanted to believe that life had more to offer than waiting in an empty house for a husband who no longer prioritized me. I spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, imagining what life could be if I chose myself first. The thought terrified me and yet sparked a flicker of hope. Could I rebuild my life on my own terms? Could I find joy outside the shadow of a marriage that had grown cold? Mark's choices forced me to confront these questions head-on. I was no longer willing to be a silent witness to my own fading happiness. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with fears and doubts, but also the possibility of rediscovery. I wasn't ready to give up on love, but I was ready to love myself fiercely first. This was where my story began anew, Not with surrender but with resolve. The man I married still lived somewhere beneath the layers of work and distance, but I could no longer wait for him to return. I had to step forward even if it meant stepping alone. I thought back to the early days of our life together. The laughter, the shared dreams, the way our hands fit perfectly in each other's. Those memories were bittersweet now, reminders of what was and what could no longer be taken for granted. Mark's absence was not just physical. It was a silent message that our marriage was no longer his priority. And while that truth was painful, it also ignited a fire within me. I was ready to reclaim the pieces of myself I had lost in the shadows of his career. The path ahead was unknown, but I was no longer afraid to walk it. I would find my voice again, rediscover my passions, and build a life that honored my worth. Mark's choice was clear and so was mine. To live authentically, boldly, and with a heart open to new possibilities. As I stood at this crossroads, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and strength. The woman who had stood quietly beside Mark for 20 years was ready to stand for herself, for her happiness, her dreams, and her future. This was not the end of my story but the beginning of a chapter where I would be the author of my own fate. I was Emma, a wife who had loved deeply, a woman who had been overlooked, and now the person determined to reclaim her life, no matter the cost. The journey would be hard, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but I was ready to face it head-on. For the first time in a long time I felt a spark of hope, not for what was lost, but for what was yet to come. The road to rebuilding would be long, but I was no longer willing to stand still, waiting for a husband who had chosen his career over our family. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the journey ahead. This was my moment to rise, to rediscover my worth, and to build a future that belonged to me alone. Mark's choice had set the stage, but my resolve would write the rest of the story. When I look back on the early years of our marriage, the memories come in warm, vivid flashes. Mark's easy laughter filling our small apartment, the late-night talks where we painted our dreams on the canvas of the future. Those days felt like the foundation of everything we were building. Mark was ambitious, yes, but he was also present. He made time for us, for me, even when the world around him seemed to pull him in different directions. I remember the evenings when he would come home just in time for dinner, shedding the weight of the day's stresses at the door. We'd eat together, talk about our days, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, holding hands across the table. Those moments grounded me. They were proof that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we were a team. But as the years passed, the balance began to shift. Mark's career, which once seemed like a shared adventure, slowly transformed into a solitary pursuit. I watched as the hours he spent at the office stretched longer and longer, the late nights creeping into early mornings. The phone calls and emails that once felt like brief interruptions became his constant companions. At first, I tried to be understanding. I told myself that this was temporary, that the sacrifices were for a better future for all of us. I remember saying, "Just a little longer, Mark. We'll get through this." But the little longer stretched on, and the future we dreamed of felt more like a distant mirage. I clung to the hope that Mark would find his way back to us, that the man who once balanced his work and family life with such care would return to being the husband and father I knew. But each time he missed a recital, a birthday, or a quiet evening at home, the hope dimmed a little more. The growing distance wasn't just about missed events, it was the feeling of being ignored, of becoming invisible in my own home. Conversations with Mark became fragmented, filled with brief updates about his schedule or work crises, lacking the warmth and connection that once defined us. I tried to reach out in small ways, inviting him to dinner, suggesting a weekend getaway, or simply asking how he was feeling. But his responses were often distracted, sometimes dismissive, like he was already miles away in a world I couldn't enter. It was as if the man I married was slipping through my fingers, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I found myself retreating into silence, unsure how to bridge the growing gap. The loneliness settled deep inside me, a quiet ache that no amount of distraction could soothe. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being unreasonable? Was I demanding too much of a man chasing his dreams? Yet, beneath the surface, I knew the truth. The man I loved was still in there somewhere, but his priorities had shifted, and I was no longer at the center of his world. The slow erosion of our connection left me feeling adrift, like a ship untethered from its moorings. I remember nights when I would lie awake, listening to the house settle into silence, wondering if Mark was thinking of me at all. The silence between us became a language of its own, one that spoke of neglect and unspoken grievances. It was in those quiet moments that I felt the sharpest sting of isolation. Friends would often ask how Mark was doing, expecting me to respond with the usual stories of a busy but loving husband. Instead, I found myself swallowing the truth, fearing judgment and pity. I wanted to hold on to the image of our marriage as it once was, but the reality was harder to hide. I began to notice subtle signs of my growing loneliness, how I stopped planning for two, how I reserved the best parts of myself for moments I didn't expect him to be present for. I became cautious with my hopes, guarding my heart against further disappointment. Yet, even as the distance grew, I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I kept our home tidy, prepared meals we once enjoyed together, and smiled through the ache when Mark was too tired or distracted to notice. I told myself that this was just a phase, that love meant enduring hardship and waiting patiently. But deep down, I sensed a shift that couldn't be ignored. The man who once made me feel cherished now seemed more like a stranger walking through my life. The dreams we once shared felt like echoes fading into the background, replaced by the relentless demands of a career that consumed him. I struggled to reconcile the man I loved with the man I saw slipping away. The tension between holding on and letting go twisted inside me, a constant battle between hope and reality. I wanted to believe that love could conquer the distance, but the silence between us grew louder with each passing day. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the man beneath the exhaustion, the way his eyes softened when he saw me, or the brief smile during a shared joke. Those fleeting moments kept me tethered to the hope that we could find our way back. But they were rare, like sparks struggling to ignite a fire long extinguished. I began to question what I deserved, what love truly meant. Was it enough to be present in body alone, or did love require the full presence of heart and mind? I realized I was craving more than companionship. I needed connection, understanding, and partnership. As Mark's career took precedence, I felt myself shrinking, retreating into the shadows of a life that no longer included me fully. I feared losing not just my husband but my own identity, swallowed by the silence of neglect. I tried to reach out, to communicate my feelings, but the words felt heavy and cumbersome, often met with defensiveness or dismissal. It was as if my pain was an inconvenience, a distraction from his relentless pursuit of success. The emotional distance was a silent thief, stealing moments, memories, and the closeness we once shared. I found myself longing for the simple things: a touch, a glance, a conversation that went beyond logistics and schedules. Despite the growing void, I held on to the memory of the early years, the foundation we had built together. Those memories were bittersweet reminders of what was possible, fueling a quiet determination to find my way through the loneliness. I began to realize that hope alone wasn't enough to sustain me. I needed to confront the reality of our changing relationship, to understand that love required effort from both of us. And if that effort was no longer there, I had to find the strength to redefine what happiness meant for me. The shift in Mark's priorities forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about our marriage, about the sacrifices we were both making, and about my own needs that had been quietly ignored. I was no longer content to be a shadow in the margins of his life. In those moments of reflection, I sensed the stirrings of a new resolve, a desire to reclaim my voice and my place in the world. The years of neglect had carved out space for growth, for self-discovery, and for the possibility of a life beyond the confines of a marriage that was no longer reciprocal. I began to imagine a path where I could nurture my own dreams, where my happiness wasn't dependent on Mark's presence or approval. It was a frightening thought, but one that carried the promise of freedom and renewal. Looking back on those early years of love and balance, I understood that our story was changing. The man who once shared my dreams was now chasing a different vision, one that left me standing at the edge of a new beginning, uncertain but ready to embrace the unknown. I was learning that sometimes love means letting go of old expectations and finding the courage to stand on your own. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it was a journey I had to take, for myself, for my happiness, and for the chance to rediscover the woman I was becoming. The once familiar warmth of our marriage slowly cooled into a chill that settled deep within me. Mark's growing absence wasn't just a matter of time, it was an emotional void that no longer felt temporary or excusable. It was as if the man I married was slipping away, replaced by someone whose priorities no longer included the family we had built together. I remember the nights when I'd sit alone in our dimly lit living room, the silence pressing down like a weight. The house felt emptier with each passing day, not just because Mark was physically gone, but because the connection we once shared was unraveling. His work trips stretched longer, his late nights at the office became the norm, and the conversations we managed to have felt like hollow exchanges, devoid of the intimacy and understanding I craved. I struggled to hold on to the hope that this phase would pass, that the man I loved would return to me. But the growing distance was impossible to ignore. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage, watching from the sidelines as Mark's career took center stage, leaving me in the shadows. The resentment began to creep in, subtle at first, like a quiet undercurrent beneath the surface. I resented the missed birthdays, the forgotten anniversaries, the empty promises to make it up that never materialized. I resented the way his phone always seemed to buzz with work messages, even during the few moments we shared. Most of all, I resented the way I felt invisible, as if my presence at home was an afterthought in his busy, demanding world. But beneath the resentment was a deep, aching loneliness. I longed for connection, for the kind of love that nourishes the soul. Instead, I found myself grappling with silence and distance, yearning for the man who once held my hand through every storm, now replaced by someone I barely recognized. Our conversations became strained and infrequent. When Mark was home, his mind often seemed elsewhere, preoccupied with work deadlines or upcoming meetings. I tried to share my feelings, to open up about the loneliness that was consuming me, but my words were met with defensiveness or hurried reassurances that rang hollow. One evening, I gathered the courage to confront him. Sitting across from him at the kitchen table, I spoke honestly about how his absences and distractions were hurting me, about how I felt like I was losing not just him but myself. I expected empathy, or at least an attempt to understand. Instead, Mark's response was cold and dismissive. He told me I was overreacting, that every marriage has its ups and downs, and that he was simply doing what he had to do to provide for us. His words hit me like a slap, and I realized that the man I loved no longer saw me as a partner in this journey, but as a burden or inconvenience. The conversation left me shaken, but it also sparked a clarity I hadn't felt before. I saw that waiting for Mark to change or to prioritize us again might be futile. His career had become his world, and I was no longer at its center. The love we once shared was fading under the weight of his absence and indifference. I wrestled with conflicting emotions: love, anger, sadness, and a growing resolve to protect my own well-being. I realized that continuing to hold on to a relationship that felt so one-sided was eroding my sense of self-worth. I was at a crossroads, torn between clinging to the past and stepping into an uncertain future. This internal battle was exhausting. I oscillated between hope and despair, between the desire to fix what was broken, and the fear that it might be beyond repair. The nights were the hardest, filled with restless thoughts and questions that had no easy answers. I began to notice how this emotional distance rippled through every aspect of my life. I withdrew from friends, afraid to expose the cracks in my marriage. I stopped making plans, unsure if Mark would be there to share them. Even simple joys felt muted, overshadowed by the growing void between us. Yet amid the pain I found moments of strength. Small acts of self-care. A walk in the park, a visit to an art gallery, a phone call with a trusted friend, reminded me that I was more than my marriage, more than the neglect I was enduring. These moments were lifelines, pulling me back from the edge of despair. I also started to pay attention to the subtle changes within myself. The woman who had once defined herself by her role as wife and partner was beginning to question what she truly needed to feel loved and fulfilled. I realized that love without mutual respect and attention was not enough to sustain me. Mark's growing neglect forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about our marriage. I saw that his career ambitions had become a barrier between us, a wedge driven deeper with every missed moment. The man I loved was still there, but his heart and mind were elsewhere, and I was left to navigate the loneliness alone. I found myself asking, how much longer could I endure this imbalance? Was it fair to sacrifice my happiness for a dream that no longer included me? These questions haunted me, but they also fueled a quiet determination to seek a life where I was seen, valued, and loved fully. The resentment I felt was not just directed at Mark, but at the situation that had left me isolated. I resented the way our marriage had shifted from partnership to neglect. I resented the silence that had become our default mode of communication. And I resented the way I had begun to lose myself in the process. But amidst the turmoil, I knew that resentment alone could not free me. It was a signal, a beacon pointing me toward the need for change. I had to decide whether to accept this new reality or to fight for a different future, one where my needs mattered as much as Mark's ambitions. One afternoon, I sat by the window, watching the world outside move on without me. The realization dawned that waiting for Mark to come back, to notice me, to rekindle what we had, might mean waiting forever. And in that moment, I understood that I could not continue to live in the shadows of his career and neglect. I began to consider what it would mean to reclaim my life, to step out of the emotional fog that had enveloped me. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was afraid of the unknown, of the changes that might come, but I was also hungry for the possibility of healing and growth. Mark's choices had forced me into a corner, but they had also opened a door. I could choose to remain trapped in a marriage that left me feeling invisible, or I could choose to seek a path where I was seen and valued. The decision was mine to make. As the days passed, the storm inside me settled into a steady resolve. I would no longer let Mark's neglect define my happiness. I deserved more than empty apologies and absent affection. I deserved a life filled with connection, respect, and love, whether that came from him or from somewhere else. The road ahead was uncertain and the challenges daunting. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that I could reclaim my life and find fulfillment on my own terms. The emotional distance between Mark and me had become a chasm, but it was also a catalyst. It forced me to confront the reality of our marriage and the truth about what I needed. And with that truth came the courage to face whatever lay ahead, no matter how difficult. The moment I sat down with Mark to lay my feelings bare, I felt a mix of dread and necessity swirling inside me. It was an evening thick with unspoken tension, the silence between us heavier than usual. I knew I could no longer carry this weight alone, nor could I pretend that the growing distance was just a phase that would pass with time. Something had to change. I chose my words carefully, hoping to reach the man I once knew beneath the exhaustion and detachment. Mark, I began, voice trembling slightly, I feel like we're drifting apart. Your job takes so much of you, and I'm left here, feeling invisible and alone. I need you to know how much this hurts. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of recognition, maybe even guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a shield of defensiveness. He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair, as if the weight of my words was too much to bear. Emma, I'm doing this for us, he said, his tone edged with frustration. You know how important my work is. I have responsibilities, deadlines, meetings, clients. It's not like I want to be away from you, but I have to provide for this family. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. His words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they felt like a dismissal of my pain. It was as if my feelings were collateral damage in the pursuit of his career. I wanted to tell him that sacrifices should be shared, that a marriage was a partnership, not a one-sided transaction. But the words caught in my throat. I looked into his eyes, searching for the man who had once promised to walk beside me through every storm. Instead, I saw a man overwhelmed, distant, and unwilling or perhaps unable to meet me halfway. The person I loved seemed lost beneath the weight of his ambitions. In that moment, clarity washed over me. I realized that no matter how much I hoped for change, Mark was entrenched in a world where I was no longer a priority. His career wasn't just a part of his life, it had become the axis around which everything else revolved, and I was left orbiting on the periphery. The conversation ended with a tense silence, the kind that speaks volumes in its absence of words. I felt drained, but also strangely resolved. I couldn't keep waiting for Mark to realize what I needed, especially when he seemed unwilling to see it. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, sadness, anger, and a growing sense of determination. I knew I had to prioritize my own well-being, to stop sacrificing my happiness on the altar of a marriage that felt increasingly one-sided. I began to envision a life where I was no longer defined by Mark's choices or absences. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. I had spent so long putting his needs first that I'd forgotten what it meant to nurture my own dreams and desires. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, searching for the woman I had become beneath the layers of neglect and disappointment. I saw a woman tired but resilient, a woman who deserved more than to be an afterthought. I started making small changes, reclaiming hobbies I had set aside, reconnecting with friends I had neglected, and allowing myself moments of joy without guilt. Each step felt like a quiet rebellion against the life that had confined me. Mark noticed the shift, though I'm not sure he understood its significance. When I mentioned my desire to take a part-time course in something I'd always loved, writing, he shrugged it off, saying, "If that makes you happy." But there was no warmth in his voice, no encouragement. His indifference only strengthened my resolve. I realized that waiting for his approval was a trap. My happiness couldn't be contingent on someone who had chosen to prioritize everything but me. I began to set boundaries, gently at first, around what I was willing to accept. I stopped waiting by the phone for his calls, stopped holding my breath when he came home late. I learned to say no to the guilt that tried to pull me back into silence. These changes weren't easy. There were moments when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I questioned if I was being selfish or too harsh. But each time, I reminded myself that seeking happiness wasn't a betrayal, it was a necessity. As I carved out space for myself, I noticed a subtle transformation. My confidence grew, and with it, a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I was learning to stand on my own, to find fulfillment beyond the confines of a marriage that no longer nurtured me. Mark's reaction to my newfound independence was complicated. Sometimes he seemed jealous, his eyes darkening when I spoke about my classes or new friends. Other times he was distant, retreating further into his work as if to avoid the changes in me. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where his irritation simmered beneath polite conversation, I realized that the man I loved and the man before me were diverging paths that might never cross again in the way I once hoped. I felt a pang of grief for the life we might have had, for the dreams we once shared. But alongside that grief was a growing certainty that I deserved to be seen and valued fully, not just in moments of convenience. That night, as I lay awake, I made a silent promise to myself. I would no longer shrink to fit into a life that left me wanting. I would pursue the happiness that had eluded me for so long, even if it meant walking a path without Mark. The confrontation with Mark, though painful, was a turning point. It forced me to face the reality of our marriage and to acknowledge that love alone wasn't enough when it wasn't reciprocated. I needed more respect, attention, and partnership. I began to understand that reclaiming my life wouldn't be a single moment but a journey. It would require courage, patience, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. But I was ready. With each step, I felt myself shedding the weight of neglect and disappointment. I was no longer willing to wait in the wings of a life that wasn't mine to live alone. Mark's career might remain his priority, but I was reclaiming mine. My happiness, my dreams, and my future were mine to shape. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope that I could build a life where I was not just surviving but truly living. The morning I decided to take control of my life felt like waking from a long, suffocating dream. I knew that holding on to a marriage where my needs were sidelined was no longer sustainable. It was time to focus on myself, to rediscover the passions I had buried beneath years of neglect and silence. For so long, I had to find my happiness through Mark's presence, his attention, his approval, his love. But as I peeled back the layers of disappointment, I found a woman yearning for more, for freedom, for joy, for a life that reflected her own desires. I enrolled in a creative writing course that had always intrigued me but which I'd dismissed as a frivolous indulgence. The moment I signed up, a surge of excitement and fear coursed through me. It was as if I was stepping into a new world, one where I could reclaim my voice and my identity beyond being Mark's wife. The first day of class was a revelation. Surrounded by strangers who shared my passion, I felt a spark I hadn't known in years. Writing became my refuge, a place where I could pour out the swirling emotions that had long been trapped inside. Each word I penned was a small act of rebellion against the silence that had defined my marriage. Yet this newfound pursuit was not without its challenges. Mark's reaction to my decision was muted, almost indifferent. When I told him about the course, he simply nodded and said, "If that makes you happy." There was no warmth, no encouragement, just a casual dismissal that stung more than I expected. His indifference deepened my resolve. I realized I no longer needed his approval to chase my dreams. For years, I had waited for him to see me, to value me. Now I was choosing to see and value myself. As I immersed myself in writing, I began to notice subtle changes within. My confidence grew, and with it, a quiet joy that radiated from the core of who I was becoming. I started reconnecting with old friends and making new ones, people who supported and inspired me, who saw me as more than just a wife or a shadow in someone else's life. Mark, however, seemed unsettled by these changes. I caught glimpses of jealousy in his eyes when I spoke about my classes or shared my writing with friends. There were moments when he would attempt to pull me back into the old routine, suggesting I spent less time on my hobbies and more time with him. But I had learned to set firm boundaries. I gently but firmly told him that my happiness was no longer negotiable. The emotional tug-of-war was exhausting at times. Mark's growing jealousy contrasted sharply with his earlier indifference, leaving me confused about what he truly wanted. Yet, I remained steadfast, knowing that my growth and happiness could not be compromised. The transformation extended beyond my personal pursuits. I began taking better care of myself physically, emotionally, and mentally. I reintroduced exercise into my routine, started cooking meals that nourished me, and allowed myself moments of solitude and reflection without guilt. With each step, the woman I was becoming felt more authentic and alive. I was no longer defined by Mark's choices or absences but by my own courage and determination to thrive. Of course, the journey was far from smooth. There were moments of doubt and loneliness, times when the weight of change felt overwhelming. I questioned whether I was being selfish, whether I was abandoning the marriage I had once cherished. But those doubts were fleeting, overshadowed by the growing clarity that I deserved a life filled with respect and joy. Mark's career continued to demand his time and energy, often leaving me to navigate our changing relationship alone. His focus remained fixed on work, and despite his occasional attempts to reconnect, I sensed that our paths were diverging. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself sitting on the porch, writing in my journal as the sun dipped below the horizon. Mark joined me briefly, his presence a quiet reminder of the life we had built together. He looked at me with a mixture of longing and regret, but the words to bridge the gap between us remained unspoken. I realized that while our marriage might not be salvageable in its current form, I was building something new within myself, a foundation of self-worth and independence that no one could take away. This realization was both liberating and bittersweet. I mourned the loss of the closeness we once shared but embraced the possibility of a future defined by my own choices. As I continued to grow, I found strength in community. Friends and classmates became a support network, encouraging me to pursue my passions and reminding me that I was not alone. Their belief in me fueled my confidence, helping me face the uncertainties ahead. I began to share my writing with a small circle, receiving feedback and encouragement that bolstered my spirit. The act of creating, of expressing my thoughts and emotions, became a powerful healing tool. Through this process, I discovered that reclaiming my life was not about rejecting Mark, but about embracing myself. It was about finding balance between honoring the past and stepping boldly into the future. Mark's initial indifference and later jealousy underscored the complexity of our evolving relationship. I understood that his career and ambitions were deeply ingrained in who he was, just as my journey towards independence was becoming an essential part of mine. The tension between us was a reflection of these diverging paths. Yet, I felt ready to navigate it with honesty and grace, holding firm to the boundaries I had set. I knew the road ahead would be challenging. There would be difficult conversations, moments of pain, and times when I might falter. But the seed of transformation had been planted, and I was determined to nurture it. In those quiet moments of reflection, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. I was no longer waiting for Mark to change or to prioritize me. I was choosing to prioritize myself, to live authentically and fully regardless of what the future held for our marriage. This was my moment of reclamation, a turning point where I stepped out of the shadows and into the light of my own becoming. The journey was just beginning, but I was ready to face it with courage, hope, and an open heart. The months that followed my decision to focus on myself became a landscape of transformation, a journey that both terrified and exhilarated me. As I immersed myself in my writing course and rekindled connections with old friends, I began to feel a blossoming sense of confidence and joy that had long been absent from my life. It was as if I was rediscovering a part of myself that had been buried beneath years of neglect and emotional distance. Each class was a sanctuary, a place where I could express the swirling emotions inside me, put words to the pain, the hope, and the dreams I was learning to nurture again. Surrounded by people who shared my passion, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Writing became more than a hobby, it was a lifeline, a way to reclaim my voice and my story. As my world expanded, I noticed subtle shifts in the way I carried myself. My posture straightened, my gaze grew steadier, and a quiet strength radiated from within. I was no longer the woman who waited anxiously for Mark's attention or approval. I was becoming someone who valued herself, who understood that her happiness was not dependent on another's choices. Mark, meanwhile, began to notice these changes, though his reactions were mixed and often confusing. Sometimes, when I spoke enthusiastically about a new writing assignment or gathering with friends, I caught a flicker of jealousy in his eyes. It was as though seeing me thrive independently unsettled him more than he let on. There were moments when he would try to draw me back into the routines of our old life, suggesting we have dinner together more often or spend weekends at home. But beneath the surface, I sensed a resistance. His career and the life he had built around it still held his primary focus. His attempts felt half-hearted, as if the idea of truly reconnecting was more daunting than simply maintaining the status quo. I found myself setting firmer boundaries without guilt. I politely declined invitations when they conflicted with my classes or social engagements. I made space in my schedule for the things that fueled my soul, no longer shrinking to fit into a life that didn't honor my growth. The tension between us was palpable at times, a silent undercurrent that neither of us seemed ready to confront fully. Yet, I recognized that this was part of the process, the unraveling of old patterns and the emergence of new identities. Mark and I were on diverging paths, each navigating our own challenges and desires. Outside our home, my support network flourished. Friends became my cheerleaders, encouraging me to pursue my passions and reminding me of my worth. Their belief in me buoyed my confidence and helped me face the uncertainties ahead. I began to see that I was not alone, that my happiness could be nurtured through connections built on mutual respect and care. The creative process itself was deeply healing. Writing allowed me to explore my feelings with honesty and clarity, to confront the pain of neglect and the thrill of newfound freedom. I started sharing my work with a small circle, receiving feedback that encouraged me to push beyond my comfort zone. This journey was not without its challenges. There were days when loneliness crept in, when the weight of change felt overwhelming. Doubts whispered that I was selfish or that I was abandoning the life I had known. But these moments were fleeting, eclipsed by the growing certainty that I deserved a life filled with joy and respect. Mark's career continued to demand his time and energy, often leaving me to navigate the shifting dynamics of our relationship on my own. His focus remained fixed on work, and despite occasional attempts to reconnect, I sensed that the emotional distance between us was widening. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mark and I sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. He looked at me with a mixture of longing and regret, but the conversation we needed to have was elusive. It was as if both of us were afraid to confront the reality that our marriage had changed irrevocably. In that moment, I felt a pang of grief for the life we might have had, for the dreams we once shared. But alongside that grief was a growing sense of peace, a recognition that I was building something new within myself. A foundation of self-worth and independence that no one could take away. As I continued to evolve, I embraced the complexity of our relationship. Mark's ambitions were a part of who he was, just as my journey towards self-discovery was becoming an essential part of mine. The tension between us was a reflection of these diverging paths, but I was learning to navigate it with courage and grace. I understood that reclaiming my life was not about rejecting Mark, but about embracing myself fully. It was about honoring my needs and desires, even when they conflicted with the life we had built together. The transformation extended beyond my personal growth. I began to take better care of my physical health, incorporating exercise and mindful eating into my routine. I nurtured my emotional well-being through meditation and therapy, gaining tools to manage the waves of change and uncertainty. With each step, I felt more grounded, more connected to the woman I was becoming. The journey was not linear. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the old pain resurfaced. But the overall trajectory was one of healing and empowerment. Mark's reactions to my growth remained complex. Sometimes he was supportive in small ways, acknowledging my accomplishments or showing interest in my writing. Other times he withdrew, retreating further into his work as if to avoid the changes that threatened the balance of our lives. Through it all, I held firm to the boundaries I had set. I reminded myself that my happiness was not negotiable, that my worth was not defined by Mark's presence or approval. The months of transformation culminated in a quiet confidence that radiated from within. I was no longer waiting for Mark to change or to prioritize our relationship. I was choosing to live authentically, to pursue joy and fulfillment on my own terms. This newfound strength gave me the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but I felt ready to embrace it with an open heart and a resilient spirit. As I looked back on the journey, I saw that the distance between Mark and me had been a catalyst, a painful but necessary force that propelled me towards self-discovery. I was no longer just a wife defined by someone else's ambitions. I was a woman reclaiming her life, her voice, and her dreams. And in that reclamation, I found a freedom I had never known, a freedom to be fully, unapologetically myself. Mark's jealousy was subtle at first, like a faint shadow flickering at the edge of our interactions. I noticed it in the way his eyes lingered a little too long when I spoke about my writing classes or the new friends I had made. It was there in the slight tightening of his jaw when I declined his invitations to spend evenings together, choosing instead to attend a workshop or meet with my support network. His reactions unsettled me, stirring a mix of confusion and quiet satisfaction. I was thriving independently, but his discomfort was a stark reminder of the changing dynamics between us. At times, Mark's jealousy manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways. He'd make offhand remarks about the time I was spending away from home, or question the importance of the people I was connecting with. One evening, as I was preparing to leave for a reading group, he said, "I don't get why you need to be out so much. Isn't home enough?" His tone was casual, but the underlying message was clear. He felt threatened by my growing world beyond him. These moments left me conflicted. Part of me wanted to soothe his insecurities, to reassure him that my pursuit of happiness wasn't a rejection of our marriage. But another part of me recognized that his jealousy was less about me and more about his own discomfort with the changes in our relationship. I refused to let his unease derail the progress I was making. His subtle attempts to pull me back into the familiarity of our old life grew more frequent. He suggested dinners at our favorite restaurant, weekend plans that revolved around home improvements or quiet nights in. On the surface, these offers seemed like gestures of reconnection, but I sensed an undercurrent, a desire to contain me within the boundaries of a life that no longer fit. I remember one weekend when he insisted we spend Saturday together, unplugged and uninterrupted. I agreed, hoping that time together might bridge the growing gap between us. But the day unfolded with a quiet tension. Mark seemed distracted, checking his phone when he thought I wasn't looking and retreating into silence when I tried to share my thoughts and experiences. That evening, as we sat side by side on the couch, I realized the distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a barrier neither of us seemed ready to dismantle. I wanted to reach for him to find common ground, but my newfound strength whispered that I deserved more than half-hearted attempts and empty promises. Mark's jealousy sometimes took a more insidious form, a quiet criticism of my choices or subtle undermining of my confidence. He'd question the value of my writing or suggest that my new friends didn't understand the realities of real life. These comments were hurtful, but they also revealed his fear of losing me to a world he no longer controlled. I began to see that his jealousy was not just about me, it was about the shifting power dynamics in our marriage. For years I had been the supportive wife, the one who adapted to his career demands and put his needs first. Now, as I carved out my own path, the balance was tipping and it unsettled him deeply. Despite these challenges, I refused to let Mark's jealousy dictate my actions or diminish my worth. I set clear boundaries, gently but firmly communicating that my happiness and growth were non-negotiable. I told him that while I valued our history and the life we had shared, I needed space to thrive as an individual. This was not always easy. There were moments when Mark's jealousy flared into frustration or withdrawal, leaving me feeling caught between compassion and self-preservation. I grappled with guilt, wondering if I was being too harsh or selfish. But I reminded myself that growth often comes with discomfort, and that prioritizing my well-being was essential. As the months passed, I noticed a subtle shift in our interactions. Mark's jealousy began to give way to a grudging respect. He started to acknowledge my accomplishments, albeit quietly, and occasionally asked about my writing projects without the usual edge of criticism. One evening after a reading group, I came home to find Mark waiting for me with a cup of tea. He didn't say much, but the gesture spoke volumes. It was a small bridge, a sign that despite the distance, there was still a thread of connection between us. These moments were fragile and rare, but they offered a glimpse of hope, that even amidst change and uncertainty, relationships could evolve rather than fracture entirely. I also noticed that Mark's jealousy sometimes masked his own loneliness. He was struggling to reconcile the demands of his career with the changes in our marriage, and my independence highlighted the gaps he had neglected. It was a painful realization that the man I loved was as much a victim of circumstance as I was. Understanding this complexity helped me approach our interactions with greater empathy. I could acknowledge his fears without sacrificing my own needs. It was a delicate balance, honoring the history we shared while forging a new path forward. I began to communicate more openly about my boundaries and desires, inviting Mark into honest conversations about where we were and where we wanted to go. These talks were difficult, often filled with awkward pauses and unspoken fears, but they were necessary. Mark reluctantly admitted that he felt threatened by the changes, that he was afraid of losing me to a life he no longer understood. I reassured him that my growth was not a rejection of him but a reclaiming of myself, a journey we both needed to respect. This acknowledgement didn't erase the challenges, but it laid the groundwork for mutual understanding. We were navigating uncharted territory, learning to redefine our relationship in a way that honored both our needs. I continued to nurture my independence, embracing the friendships, passions, and creative pursuits that enriched my life. Mark's jealousy, though still present at times, became less of a barrier and more of a signal, a reminder that change was difficult but also necessary. Through it all, I learned that empowerment meant standing firm in my truth while extending compassion to the complexities of those I loved. I was no longer willing to let jealousy or insecurity dictate the terms of my happiness. Instead, I chose to embrace growth, courage, and the possibility of transformation for myself and, perhaps, for us both. The journey was far from over. Mark's jealousy and my evolving identity would continue to test the boundaries of our marriage. But I felt ready to face these challenges with honesty and resilience, knowing that my happiness was worth the struggle. In reclaiming my life, I was discovering the strength to love fully and fiercely both myself and the imperfect, evolving relationship that Mark and I shared. I realized that reclaiming my happiness meant more than just pursuing my passions. It required setting firm boundaries with Mark, boundaries I hadn't dared to establish before. For years, I had let his career and needs dictate the rhythm of our lives, shrinking myself to fit into the margins he left behind. But now I understood that to truly thrive, I had to protect my emotional space and assert my needs unapologetically. It began with small acts of self-respect. When Mark's work demands encroached on our limited time together, I stopped excusing his absences or smoothing over disappointment. Instead, I voiced my feelings honestly, telling him that I needed more than occasional presence or distracted attention. I made it clear that my happiness was not contingent on his career success or approval, it was my own responsibility. These conversations were uncomfortable and sometimes met with resistance. Mark would brush off my concerns or respond with defensiveness, insisting that he was doing his best under pressure. But I stood my ground, refusing to be sidelined by excuses or dismissals. I reminded myself that setting boundaries was an act of love for myself and for the relationship we still shared. I also became vigilant about my personal time and space. I carved out moments in my day for writing, reflection, and connection with friends, protecting them as sacred parts of my routine. When Mark questioned why I needed so much time away or seemed jealous of my independence, I gently reinforced that this was essential for my well-being. At first, Mark struggled to accept these changes. His discomfort was palpable, manifesting in subtle attempts to pull me back into old patterns, suggesting we spend more evenings together or questioning the importance of my activities. But I remained firm, explaining that boundaries were not about pushing him away but about creating a healthier dynamic where both of us could coexist authentically. I learned to say no without guilt, to decline invitations or requests that compromised my peace. I stopped apologizing for prioritizing myself, recognizing that self-care was not selfish but necessary. This shift was empowering, a declaration that my worth was not measured by how much I sacrificed for others. The process wasn't always smooth. There were moments when Mark's resistance provoked doubt and frustration. I questioned whether my demands were reasonable or if I was risking too much by asserting myself. But each time, I reminded myself of the toll that silence and accommodation had taken on my spirit. I also sought support from friends and mentors, sharing my struggles and victories as I navigated this new terrain. Their encouragement bolstered my confidence, reminding me that setting boundaries was a sign of strength, not weakness. As I embraced this empowered identity, I noticed a subtle but profound shift in our relationship. Mark began to respect my limits, even if reluctantly at times. He noticed that my happiness no longer hinged on his actions, and that changed the dynamic between us. Conversations became more honest, less fraught with unspoken expectations or resentments. I felt freer to express my needs without fear of rejection or dismissal. Mark, in turn, seemed to recognize that his career could not be the sole defining force in our lives if we wanted to sustain what remained of our connection. This newfound balance was fragile but promising. I understood that boundaries were not barriers but bridges, tools to foster respect and understanding rather than division. By honoring myself, I was inviting Mark to meet me in a space of mutual care. I also discovered that boundaries extended beyond Mark to other areas of my life. I became more selective about how I spent my energy and time, choosing relationships and activities that nourished rather than drained me. This holistic approach deepened my sense of self and reinforced the importance of protecting my well-being. The journey of empowerment was ongoing. There were days when old habits tempted me to revert to people-pleasing or silence, but I was learning to recognize those patterns and choose differently. Each boundary I set was a step toward reclaiming my voice and my happiness. I found that embracing this empowered self allowed me to be more present and authentic in my relationships, including with Mark. I was no longer a shadow fading into the background, but a woman standing firmly in her truth. This evolution also brought clarity about what I wanted and deserved, not just from Mark but from life itself. I realized that love required effort from both partners, and that I could no longer accept a relationship where my needs were secondary. I began to envision a future where I was whole and fulfilled, whether that included Mark or not. This vision was both frightening and exhilarating, a testament to the courage I was cultivating within. As I continued to set boundaries and nurture my independence, I felt a growing sense of peace and confidence. I was no longer defined by the neglect or distance of the past but by the strength and clarity of my present choices. Mark and I were still navigating the complexities of our marriage, but the foundation was shifting. I was no longer waiting for him to change, but inviting him to join me in a partnership based on respect and mutual care. Through this process, I learned that empowerment was not about control or dominance, but about honoring myself and expecting the same in return. It was about creating a life where I could thrive, fully and unapologetically. I was Emma, the woman who had loved deeply, who had faced heartbreak and neglect, and who was now rising with a fierce determination to live authentically. Setting boundaries was not the end of my story, but a powerful chapter in my journey toward self-discovery and lasting fulfillment. And as I embraced this path, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that my happiness was mine to claim and protect. The conversation was long overdue, but when Mark and I finally sat down to speak candidly about our marriage, the air between us was thick with years of unspoken feelings and unmet expectations. It was a moment of reckoning, a crossroads where we had to face the reality of what our relationship had become, and what, if anything, remained worth fighting for. I remember the way my heart pounded as I opened the dialogue. I wanted to be honest yet gentle, to express the truth of my experience without casting blame. "Mark," I began, "we've been drifting for so long that sometimes I'm not even sure what we are anymore. I need to know if there's a path forward for us, one where we both feel valued and connected." Mark looked away for a moment, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. When he met my eyes again, there was a vulnerability there I hadn't seen in a long time. "Emma," he said quietly, "I know I haven't been the husband you deserve. I've been so wrapped up in my career that I lost sight of us. I'm sorry for the pain I caused." His apology was a start, but I needed more than words. "I appreciate that, Mark," I replied, "but we both need to be clear about what we want and what we're willing to do to make this work. I can't keep sacrificing my happiness for a marriage that feels one-sided." He nodded slowly, the weight of his own reflection evident. "I've made mistakes and I don't want to lose you, but I also know I can't turn back time. I'm willing to try, but I need to understand what that means for us, what you need from me." I took a deep breath, feeling the courage to lay my needs bare. "I need transparency, Mark. I need to feel like a priority, not an afterthought. I want us to communicate openly, to support each other's dreams while nurturing our connection. If that's not possible, we have to be honest about what comes next." The honesty between us was raw and fragile, but it was a beginning, a space where we could confront the painful truths without turning away. Mark admitted that his career had become a shield and a distraction, a way to avoid confronting the gaps that had grown between us. We talked about the ways we had hurt each other, the missed moments, the silent disappointments, and the growing resentment that had festered beneath the surface. It was painful to hear and to admit, but it was necessary for any chance of healing. As the conversation deepened, we began to explore what a redefined partnership might look like. Could we rebuild trust and closeness on new terms? Could we support each other's growth without losing sight of our shared history? Mark expressed a willingness to make changes, more presence, more openness, a commitment to listening without defensiveness. I shared my intention to continue pursuing my passions and maintaining the boundaries that protected my well-being. There was an unspoken understanding that this would not be easy, that old patterns would resist and that setbacks were inevitable. But for the first time in a long while, we both seemed willing to face those challenges together. We discussed the possibility that our marriage might take a different shape than before, perhaps less traditional but more honest and fulfilling in its own way. Whether that meant staying together as partners or choosing to part with respect and kindness was a question for the future. What mattered now was that we were no longer avoiding the truth or pretending that things could remain as they were. We were confronting our reality with open hearts and a readiness to listen. The conversation left me with a mix of emotions, hope, uncertainty, and a renewed sense of agency. I realized that love requires effort from both people, and that I deserved a relationship where my needs were met with care and respect. Mark's reluctant acknowledgement of his past mistakes was a step toward accountability, but I knew that actions would speak louder than words. Trust would need to be rebuilt through consistent effort and genuine connection. I felt proud of myself for speaking my truth, and for insisting on a partnership that honored my worth. It was a declaration that I would no longer settle for less than I deserved. In the days that followed, Mark and I began to implement small changes, more honest check-ins, shared activities that fostered connection, and a conscious effort to prioritize our relationship alongside our individual pursuits. There were moments of progress and moments of struggle, but the commitment to growth was a beacon guiding us through the uncertainty. I also recognized that redefining our marriage was not about fixing something broken but about creating something new, an evolving partnership that reflected who we were now, not who we once hoped to be. This process challenged me to balance hope with realism, to embrace vulnerability without losing strength. It was a dance of patience and persistence, of holding space for both love and change. As Mark and I navigated this new chapter, I felt a sense of empowerment. I was no longer a passive participant in my marriage but an active co-creator of its future. The conversation was not a conclusion but a new beginning, a moment of clarity that opened the door to possibilities, whether together or apart. I carried with me the understanding that I deserved a love that nourished and uplifted me, and that I had the courage to seek it, no matter the outcome. Mark and I were embarking on a journey of reevaluation, mindful of the past but focused on building a future defined by honesty, respect, and mutual care. And in that awareness, I found a quiet strength, the belief that whatever path we chose, it would be one where my happiness and self-worth were honored above all. The day I fully embraced my new life felt like stepping into sunlight after years of wandering through shadows. I was no longer the woman defined by a marriage that had left me feeling invisible and unheard. Instead, I had become someone who recognized her worth, who honored her dreams, and who dared to choose happiness on her own terms. Reclaiming my independence wasn't a sudden transformation but a gradual unfolding, a series of choices made each day to prioritize myself, to nurture my passions, and to surround myself with people who valued me. I rediscovered the joy of writing, pouring my thoughts and emotions onto the page, letting the stories I told become a mirror for my own healing. I found freedom in my creativity, a sanctuary where I could express the complexities of my journey without fear or judgment. Sharing my work with others opened new doors, connections with kindred spirits who understood the courage it took to start over and the resilience required to keep going. Through these relationships, I learned that happiness wasn't a distant prize to be won but a state of being cultivated from within. It was in the laughter shared with friends, the quiet moments of reflection, and the simple pleasures that had once seemed out of reach. Mark's presence in my life had changed, as had the nature of our relationship. We were no longer entwined in the seamless partnership of our youth but had found a tentative balance defined by honesty and respect. Whether our paths would converge or diverge in the future remained uncertain, but I no longer feared either possibility. The empowerment I felt came from knowing that I could thrive alone if I had to, that my happiness was not contingent on another's choices or approval. It was a profound shift, from waiting for love to arrive to choosing love for myself every day. I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, the pain, the doubt, the moments of despair, and I honored each one for the lessons they carried. They had shaped me, challenged me, and ultimately led me to a place of clarity and strength. I was no longer afraid to stand in my truth, to claim my desires, and to live authentically. The woman I had become was resilient, compassionate, and fiercely determined to create a life of meaning and joy. This new chapter was not without challenges. There were still moments of loneliness and uncertainty, times when the past whispered its doubts and fears. But I met those moments with grace, knowing that they were part of the human experience, not a sign of failure. I cultivated a daily practice of gratitude and self-care, grounding myself in the present and celebrating the small victories that marked my progress. Each day was an opportunity to deepen my connection with myself and the world around me. I embraced the freedom to choose how I spent my time, who I shared it with, and what I made of my future. The possibilities stretched out before me like an open road, inviting exploration and adventure. In choosing myself, I discovered a wellspring of joy that no external circumstance could diminish. I learned that happiness was not a destination but a journey, a continuous unfolding of self-love, acceptance, and courage. Looking ahead, I felt a sense of peace and excitement. The future was mine to shape, guided by the wisdom I had gained and the strength I had cultivated. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I had everything I needed within me. I was Emma, the woman who had loved deeply, who had faced heartbreak and neglect, and who had risen from the ashes to reclaim her life. I was the artist, the dreamer, the survivor, and the creator of my own destiny. And in that truth, I found lasting fulfillment, a life defined not by what I had lost but by the boundless possibilities of what I had found, myself.